The Strait of Hormuz is the most fragile artery in the global economy, a narrow corridor. 1/5 of the world's oil flows through here every day. Each drop is a pulse of modern civilization. But that flow hangs by a thread. One missile, one political decision, one stranded ship like the Ever Given in the Suez Canal in 2021, and the strait can freeze overnight. Tankers drift, ports go quiet, prices spike. That is why Gulf states have been building their escape routes, not on the surface, underground, in the desert. 2 hidden pipelines now redraw the map of energy security. By the end of this film, you will see how these buried lines could decide which economies survive and which collapse when the Strait of Hormuz stops beating. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another line on a nautical chart, it is the valve through which most of the Gulf's oil must flow. From Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar toward Europe, Asia, and North America. Slow a tanker here, and the price of a barrel echoes in every gas station from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. The strait sits in one of the most volatile corridors on Earth. One military clash, one attack, one grounding, any of them can paralyze the movement of crude for days or weeks. That vulnerability is not new. Back in the early 1980s, as the Iran-Iraq war intensified and tankers became targets, Saudi Arabia saw the threat clearly. The Gulf was turning into a shooting range. Ships were being struck, insurance costs soared, oil buyers began to panic. Saudi Arabia needed a way out, one that did not rely on the strait at all. So they built one. Construction on the East-West pipeline began in 1980. By 1983 to 1984, the line was operational. It was an extraordinary undertaking, not just for its scale, but for its urgency. The pipeline was not built in peacetime as a precaution. It was built in the shadow of war with very specific purpose, to keep Saudi oil moving to global markets, even if the strait became a battlefield. That pipeline is Petroline, 1,201 kilometers, from Abqaiq in the eastern interior all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to Yanbu on the Red Sea. If Saudi Arabia is a house with 2 sides, the front door opens onto the Persian Gulf, where ships must pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Petroline is the back door, the one that opens directly onto the Red Sea, completely bypassing the strait. The UAE built its own answer. The Habshan Fujairah pipeline, also known as ADCOP, runs about 360 to 400 kilometers from onshore fields at Habshan, in Abu Dhabi's interior, to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Fujairah sits on the other side of the Hajar Mountains, facing the Indian Ocean, not the Persian Gulf. From there, tankers can sail east and south without ever crossing the strait. The pipeline is, in effect, a tunnel through the mountain. It carries oil from inside the bay to the open sea without touching the choke point at all. Both systems were designed with the same question in mind. What happens if the Strait of Hormuz shuts? If the strait is the front door, these pipelines are the back exits. And in energy, having a choice is power. Petroline is not a theory. It is a live system, running close to maximum capacity. Its starting point is Abqaiq, not a name that appears on most maps, but one that matters more than almost any other in the global energy system. Abqaiq is the world's largest oil processing and crude stabilization facility, operated by Saudi Aramco. It processes up to 7 million barrels of crude oil every day, more than half of Saudi Arabia's total production capacity, and roughly 7% of global oil supply on its own. Think about that number. Norway is one of Europe's largest oil producers. It produces around 2 million barrels per day. Brazil, an emerging energy superpower, produces around 3 million barrels per day. Abqaiq alone processes more than both of them combined. And Abqaiq draws its crude from the fields around it, fields like Ghawar. Ghawar is the largest conventional oil field on Earth, 280 kilometers long, 40 kilometers wide. At peak output, it has produced nearly 5 million barrels per day. Today, it still runs at approximately 3.8 million barrels per day, roughly 1/3 of everything Saudi Arabia pumps from the ground. From Ghawar and surrounding fields, crude flows into Abqaiq for processing. From Abqaiq, it enters Petroline. From Petroline, it reaches Yanbu. From Yanbu, it loads onto tankers heading to Europe, Asia, and beyond. This is the chain. and it runs entirely outside the Strait of Hormuz. From Abqaiq, the pipeline crosses a desert with almost no towns and no traffic. Only endless sand. Each section of steel can weigh tens of tons. In many places, engineers had to build temporary roads just to drag them across the dunes, set up camp in the middle of the desert, work in extreme heat, then move on. The desert can reach 50 degrees Celsius. The surface burns underfoot. Metal expands in the heat, contracts at night. Every joint must be engineered so the line does not crack after decades under constant pressure. The main trunk lines are about 1.2 meters in diameter, tall enough for an adult to walk through upright, but you will not see maintenance crews crawling inside. For inspection, Saudi engineers send robotic pigs, cylindrical machines that travel hundreds of kilometers inside the pipe, checking for corrosion, fractures, and sediment without ever breaking the surface of the desert. The pipe stays buried. The robots do the work. Along the route, pumping stations act like hearts. Each one compresses the oil at high pressure so it can coast hundreds of kilometers before the next station takes over. Without them, oil does not flow naturally over this distance. It requires force, constant, sustained, engineered force. Security is layered. Pump stations and control centers are ringed with fences, cameras, and sensors. Drones and satellites monitor the full length of the route. Unusual movement triggers a response fast. In May 2019, Houthi drones attacked several Petroline pumping stations. The pipeline was briefly shut down. The damage was contained. But the attack confirmed what many already understood. Petroline is not just a commercial asset. It is a strategic target. Any adversary seeking to pressure Saudi Arabia knows exactly where to aim. Meanwhile, the UAE's Abqaiq Fujairah pipeline works in parallel. About 1.5 million barrels per day, extendable toward 1.8 million if demand requires. From Abqaiq, it slides east under the mountains to Fujairah, bypassing the strait entirely, emerging on the other side of the peninsula facing the open sea. Fujairah is more than a port. It is one of the largest oil storage hubs on the planet, holding tens of millions of barrels in surface tanks. International shipping companies refuel here regularly. Fujairah functions as a gas station for the Indian Ocean, strategically positioned at the junction between Gulf exports and Asia-bound shipping lanes. Still, neither pipeline replaces the Strait of Hormuz. Normally, 20 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every day. Petroline and Abqaiq Fujairah together carry about 8.5 to 9 million barrels per day at maximum capacity. That is 40 to 45% of what the strait moves on a normal day. In a crisis, that gap is still enormous. The world would feel it. But that 40 to 45% is enough to stop the system from collapsing entirely. A lifebuoy, not a lifeboat. This is where the balance of power splits. For Saudi Arabia, Petroline converts the strait from a fatal vulnerability into a managed risk. When the strait slows or becomes too dangerous, Saudi Arabia reroutes exports from Abqaiq to Yanbu. From Yanbu, tankers sail through the Red Sea, then either north through the Suez Canal toward Europe or south around the Cape of Good Hope toward other markets. For the UAE, Abqaiq to Fujairah does the same. Oil from Abu Dhabi slides east to Fujairah, then to the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean without ever entering the Persian Gulf shipping lane. But not every country in the region has that option. Qatar is almost entirely dependent on exports through the Strait of Hormuz. Iraq has pipelines running north toward Turkey, but most of its seaborne crude still passes through the strait. Kuwait has no meaningful bypass. They are passengers in this system, not architects. In a crisis, their leverage is minimal. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, by contrast, can choose which route to open, when to throttle it, and who gets access first. In energy, choices have always meant power. China sits at a different point in this equation. It does not control the strait, but it consumes the oil that flows through it, on a scale few countries match. On average, China imports between 1.7 and 2 million barrels per day from Saudi Arabia alone. Saudi Arabia is one of China's most critical energy suppliers, and Chinese refineries, particularly the massive coastal petrochemical complexes designed to process Gulf crude, are built around that relationship. Some Chinese companies have invested directly in Saudi and Emirati refining projects, locking in supply security at the source. When the strait becomes unstable, China's industrial engine has a direct incentive to favor cargoes loaded at Yanbu or Fujairah. These routes become lifelines for China, even though they are built on foreign soil, funded by Gulf capital, and operated by Gulf state companies. War changes all of this. In peacetime, Petroline and Habshan Fujairah are infrastructure, line items in a budget. Strategic assets on paper. In conflict, they become both survival routes and primary targets simultaneously. If the Strait of Hormuz were to shut completely, global oil supply would contract by roughly 20% overnight. Prices would spike hard, inflation would follow. Economies running on imported energy would feel the tremor within days, and in that environment, any country still able to export oil becomes a dominant market force. That is why Saudi Arabia and the UAE have spent tens of billions of dollars on these pipelines. Not because they want war, but because if war comes, they intend to still be standing when it ends. The Strait of Hormuz will not disappear. As long as the Persian Gulf remains a source of oil, the strait is still the most efficient maritime corridor to Asia and Europe. No pipeline can fully replace that. No desert route can move what an open sea lane moves. Petroline and Habshan Fujairah do not eliminate choke points. They redistribute them. A crisis may still paralyze tankers in the strait, but it will no longer be an absolute sword over the heads of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It becomes a game of flows. Which routes open, which are cut, which partners get priority access. Those who own the pipelines hold the key. For the rest of the world, the arithmetic is less comforting. The strait remains fragile. Its vulnerability is only partially offset by a few thousand kilometers of buried steel running under one of the world's hottest deserts. Prices will still spike. Currencies will still react. Economies dependent on cheap imports will still be first to shake. The difference is this: the tremor will not be total collapse. It will be a controlled, partial strangulation, with winners and with losers, the line between them drawn long before the first missile is fired. So the question was never whether the strait could be bypassed. The question was always, who built the bypass first? Saudi Arabia built Petroline in 4 years, under wartime conditions, and has been upgrading it for over 40 years since. The UAE built Habshan to Fujairah to reach the one corner of its territory that faces the open ocean. Petroline is the backdoor. Fujairah is the hidden harbor. Yanbu is the window to the Red Sea. But outside those borders, the world still depends on a single narrow channel. Slowly, silently, constantly, thumping at the edge of every global supply chain. If you have visited the UAE, transited Fujairah, or watched oil prices move through a news cycle and wondered why, drop your experience in the comments. And if you want to go deeper into the next front lines of global logistics, green corridors, alternative canals, the new choke points taking shape right now, subscribe. This channel covers the ocean as what it really is, the hidden circulatory system of the modern world.